Shadows of pain. The evening sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the Archer family's expansive penthouse. 9-year-old Amara Archer curled up on a plush velvet sofa, her small hands clutching her stomach. Her dark, coiled hair framed her face, damp with sweat, and her wide brown eyes glistened with tears of discomfort. "Sweetheart, try sipping some chamomile tea. It'll help soothe your tummy," said Grace Archer, her mother, kneeling beside her daughter. Grace's soothing voice belied the growing anxiety in her heart. She brushed Amara's curls away from her forehead and offered a faint smile. Amara shook her head weakly. "It hurts too much, Mommy. It won't help." Across the room, James Archer paced the hardwood floors, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent penthouse. His tailored suit was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, and his normally composed demeanor cracked with concern. Every so often, he glanced at the clock on the wall, each tick deepening the furrow in his brow. "The pediatrician's prescription should have started working by now," James muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled salt and pepper hair. "This isn't right." Grace's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the heating pad on Amara's stomach. The little girl whimpered at the movement, her small body curling tighter into itself. "Maybe we should take her to the hospital, James." "Something feels off," Grace said, her voice cracking with worry. She stood and placed a comforting hand on her husband's arm. James sighed, his jaw tightening as he nodded. "You're right. We can't wait any longer." He crouched beside Amara, his expression softening. "Princess, we're going to take you to the best hospital in the city. They'll find out what's wrong and make you feel better, okay?" Amara nodded slowly, her voice a fragile whisper. "Okay, Daddy." James immediately picked up his phone, dialing a direct line to one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. Being the CEO of Archer Enterprises, a multinational conglomerate, had its perks, connections to the best resources money could buy. But as a father, none of that mattered if he couldn't protect his little girl. The next morning, the Archers arrived at Corinthian Medical Center, a facility known for its state-of-the-art technology and world-class specialists. The hospital's pristine marble floors and towering glass windows gleamed under the morning sun. Despite the serene atmosphere, James and Grace's hearts were heavy with worry. A nurse led them to a private waiting area reserved for high-profile patients. Amara sat quietly on an oversized leather chair, her small frame dwarfed by the luxurious furniture. Grace held her hand tightly while James paced near the window, his phone buzzing with messages he ignored. "Dr. Latham will see you shortly," the nurse said with a polite smile before leaving the room. When the doctor entered, his presence was commanding but cold. Dr. Victor Latham, a renowned pediatric gastroenterologist, was tall and impeccably dressed in a crisp white coat. His silver-rimmed glasses reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as he scanned the room, his gaze briefly landing on Amara before shifting to James. "Mr. and Mrs. Archer," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Latham. Let's get started." Grace helped Amara to her feet and guided her into the examination room, where she perched on the edge of a sterile table. The stark environment seemed to amplify the little girl's unease. Dr. Latham flipped through her chart, his pen tapping against the clipboard. "What symptoms has she been experiencing?" he asked, addressing James directly, as though Grace and Amara weren't present. James opened his mouth to respond, but Grace interjected, her voice firm yet polite. "Amara can tell you herself, doctor. She knows her body best." Dr. Latham's expression tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. What seems to be the problem, young lady?" Amara's voice was hesitant, barely above a whisper. "My stomach hurts a lot, especially here." She pointed to her lower right side. "It's hard to eat, and I feel sick all the time." Dr. Latham scribbled notes but didn't look up. "Any changes in her diet recently?" Grace's brows knitted. "No, she's been eating the same as always. Mostly homemade meals." The doctor's lips curled slightly, an air of condescension creeping into his tone. Homemade, you say? Cultural dishes, I assume. Grace stiffened. Yes. Is that relevant? Dr. Latham's pen paused mid-stroke. He finally glanced up, his gaze piercing. It's quite common for certain dietary habits to contribute to gastrointestinal distress. Spices, oils, unconventional ingredients can wreak havoc on young digestive systems. Amara shrank under his scrutiny, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at her mother for reassurance. James stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. Doctor, we're here for solutions, not assumptions. Dr. Latham's expression didn't falter. I'll order some tests to confirm, but these symptoms align with dietary issues. I suggest introducing more conventional foods into her diet. Processed options might be gentler on her stomach. Grace's mouth opened in disbelief. Processed foods? She's been raised on nutritious, wholesome meals. This is ridiculous. The doctor's gaze turned icy. Mrs. Archer, I'm simply offering my professional opinion. If you want results, you'll need to trust my expertise. Amara's tears spilled over, her tiny frame trembling. Mommy, I want to go home, she whispered, clutching Grace's hand. James had heard enough. His normally composed demeanor fractured, and his voice dropped to a dangerously low tone. Doctor, this ends now. You've dismissed my daughter's pain, belittled her heritage, and failed to show even basic empathy. You're done here. Dr. Latham's eyes narrowed. Mr. Archer, if you'd prefer to seek another opinion, that's your prerogative. But you'll find few doctors with my credentials. James's jaw clenched. Credentials mean nothing if you can't treat your patients with respect. Consider this our last interaction. He turned to Grace and Amara, his voice softening. Let's go. We'll find someone who actually cares. As they exited the hospital, James's mind raced. His anger boiled, but so did his resolve. No one would mistreat his daughter and walk away unscathed. Dr. Latham had no idea what was coming. Seeds of justice. The car ride home from Corinthian Medical Center was tense and silent, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Amara sat in the back seat, leaning against the window, her small body exhausted from pain and the emotional toll of the visit. Grace glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, her heart aching at the sight of Amara's tear-streaked face. Beside her, James sat rigid, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His usual calm and composed demeanor was replaced by a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. We're not letting this go, James said finally, his voice steady but cold. What that doctor said, the way he treated her, it's unacceptable. I won't stand for it. Grace nodded, her jaw set in determination. No child should be made to feel like that, especially when they're already vulnerable. We're going to find someone who takes this seriously, but we're also going to make sure Dr. Latham answers for his behavior. Amara sniffled from the back seat. Is he going to get in trouble, Mommy? Grace turned to look at her daughter, her eyes softening. Sweetheart, people like that don't just get to treat others badly and walk away. Your daddy and I will make sure of that. James glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting his daughter's eyes. Princess, no one has the right to make you feel small. You're smart, brave, and stronger than anyone knows. We'll fix this, I promise. Back at the Archer penthouse, the family settled into the living room. The soft glow of the city lights filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Grace prepared a light meal for Amara. She returned with a tray of toast and warm broth, hoping her daughter could keep something down. Let's try this, sweetie, Grace said gently, sitting beside Amara on the couch. She helped her take a small sip of broth, watching her closely for any signs of discomfort. Meanwhile, James disappeared into his home office, closing the door behind him. He sat at his sleek mahogany desk, his laptop already open. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he typed out an email to his legal team, detailing the incident at the hospital. James was a man of action, and he had no intention of letting Dr. Latham's behavior go unchallenged. This is bigger than us, he thought, his jaw tightening as he hit send. How many other families has he treated this way? How many more children have been dismissed because they didn't fit his narrow view of the world? Next, James made a series of calls to trusted colleagues in the medical field. He wanted to gather as much information as possible about Dr. Latham's history and reputation. Within hours, his inbox was flooded with replies. Some praised the doctor's technical expertise but noted his lack of bedside manner. Others hinted at previous complaints, brushed aside by the hospital administration. One email, in particular, caught James's attention. It was from a former nurse at Corinthian Medical Center who claimed she had witnessed Dr. Latham's dismissive and prejudiced behavior toward other patients. He hides behind his credentials, the nurse wrote, and the hospital turns a blind eye because he brings in wealthy clients. But his arrogance is a liability, and it's only a matter of time before someone holds him accountable. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He forwarded the email to his legal team, adding a note, dig deeper. We need everything. The following morning, James and Grace took Amara to see Dr. Evelyn Harris, a renowned pediatric specialist recommended by a family friend. Dr. Harris's clinic was warm and inviting, with colorful murals on the walls and a play area in the waiting room. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment they had experienced at Corinthian Medical Center. Dr. Harris greeted them with a warm smile, kneeling to Amara's level as she introduced herself. Hi, Amara. My name is Dr. Harris, and I'm here to help you feel better. Can you tell me a little about what's been going on? Amara's nervousness eased slightly under Dr. Harris's kind gaze. She described her symptoms, this time without interruption. Dr. Harris listened attentively, nodding and asking gentle questions to better understand the situation. We're going to run some tests, Dr. Harris said, turning to James and Grace. But based on what Amara has described, I suspect this could be appendicitis. If that's the case, we'll need to act quickly. James and Grace exchanged a worried glance but were relieved to finally have a doctor who seemed genuinely invested in helping their daughter. Later that day, as Amara rested after her tests, James received a call from his legal team. We've uncovered some concerning information about Dr. Latham, said Monica, the lead attorney. There are multiple complaints filed against him for dismissive behavior and inappropriate comments. The hospital has settled a few cases quietly, but nothing has gone public. James's grip on his phone tightened. What's our next move? We'll file a formal complaint with the hospital and escalate it to the medical board, Monica replied. But if you're willing, we could also go public. A man like Dr. Latham relies on his reputation. A well-documented account of his behavior could force the hospital to act. James didn't hesitate. Do it. I want every parent in this city to know who they're dealing with. That evening, James and Grace sat together in the living room, discussing their next steps. Are we sure about going public? Grace asked, her voice tinged with concern. What if it brings unwanted attention to Amara? James reached for her hand, his gaze steady. We'll protect her, Grace. But this isn't just about us. It's about holding people accountable. Dr. Latham's arrogance ends here. Grace nodded, her resolve strengthening. You're right. We can't let him keep doing this to other families. As they spoke, Amara's soft voice interrupted them. Mommy? Daddy? They turned to see her standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bunny. Are we going to stop that mean doctor? She asked, her eyes wide with hope. James stood and scooped her up into his arms. Yes, princess. We're going to make sure he never hurts anyone else. You're so brave, and because of you, we're going to make things right. As Amara nestled into her father's embrace, the Archers knew they were just at the beginning of their fight for justice. But together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A storm of consequences. The next morning, Corinthian Medical Center buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Doctors rushed between patient rooms, nurses coordinated care, and the reception area hummed with activity. Yet, in one corner office, the atmosphere was anything but routine. Dr. Victor Latham sat at his expansive oak desk, meticulously reviewing the morning's patient files. He barely looked up when his office door swung open, revealing the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Ellen Moreno. Her face was a mask of professionalism, but the tight set of her jaw betrayed her irritation. "Victor, we need to talk," Ellen said, her tone clipped. Dr. Latham sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "Ellen, if this is about the budget proposal, This is about the Archer family," she interrupted, her words cutting through his dismissal. "Their formal complaint against you landed on my desk this morning, and it's serious. They're alleging discriminatory behavior and medical negligence." Dr. Latham's brows furrowed, though his expression remained calm. "Discriminatory? That's absurd. I treated their case no differently than any other." Ellen crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "The Archers are accusing you of dismissing their daughter's pain, making prejudiced remarks, and failing to provide appropriate care. Victor, this isn't the first time I've heard complaints about your bedside manner. But this? This could jeopardize the hospital's reputation." Dr. Latham's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Ellen, I've dedicated years to this hospital. My results speak for themselves. The Archers are one of the most influential families in the city," Ellen interrupted. "James Archer is a billionaire with connections that could bury us in lawsuits and negative press. I've already been fielding calls from our PR team." Dr. Latham leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "I refuse to let baseless accusations tarnish my record. They're overreacting." Ellen's lips thinned. "Victor, this isn't just about you anymore. I suggest you prepare a formal response, because the Archers are prepared to take this public." Across town, James Archer was in his office, surrounded by his legal team. The room, usually a hub for high-stakes business negotiations, was now a war room dedicated to holding Dr. Latham accountable. Monica, his lead attorney, stood at the head of the table, briefing the team on their strategy. "We've filed the formal complaint with the hospital," Monica began, her tone measured and professional. "Next, we'll escalate to the state medical board. But James, I think it's time we consider taking this to the press." James's eyes narrowed. "What's the potential fallout for Amara? I don't want her dragged into this more than she already has been." Monica nodded. "We'll keep her identity protected. The focus will be on Dr. Latham's pattern of behavior and the hospital's failure to address it. This isn't just about Amara, it's about preventing this from happening to other families." Grace, who had joined the meeting via video call, spoke up. "James, I think we need to do this. Dr. Latham's behavior was cruel, and who knows how many others he's hurt. Amara might be too young to understand now, but one day she'll know we stood up for her." James exhaled deeply, his gaze softening as he thought of his daughter. "You're right. Let's move forward." That evening, Grace sat with Amara in her room, helping her with a puzzle. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast a warm light over the colorful pieces scattered across the table. Amara's energy was slowly returning after her visit with Dr. Harris, who had confirmed a diagnosis of early-stage appendicitis and scheduled a laparoscopic procedure for the following week. "Mommy, is that mean doctor going to get in trouble?" Amara asked, carefully fitting a piece into place. Grace hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Well, sweetie, your daddy and I are making sure that he learns he can't treat people the way he treated you. It's important to stand up for yourself and for others." Amara looked up, her big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Will he say sorry?" Grace smiled faintly. "Sometimes people don't say sorry, even when they're wrong. But what matters is that we do what's right." Amara nodded solemnly. Okay. I hope he learns to be nice. The following day, headlines broke across major news outlets. Renowned doctor accused of discrimination and negligence by prominent family. The article detailed the Archer's allegations, highlighting Dr. Latham's history of patient complaints and the hospital's pattern of ignoring them. It included anonymous accounts from other families and former staff, painting a picture of a man whose arrogance had long gone unchecked. Social media erupted with discussions, the hashtag hold doctors accountable trending within hours. Parents shared their own stories of medical mistreatment, while others praised the Archers for using their platform to address an important issue. At Corinthian Medical Center, the fallout was immediate. Ellen Moreno called an emergency board meeting to address the crisis. Outside, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Patients deserve respect," and "Stop medical bias." Dr. Latham, meanwhile, remained defiant. In a terse statement to the press, he denied all allegations and accused the Archers of seeking attention. But his words rang hollow as more evidence surfaced, including internal emails showing the hospital's attempts to silence previous complaints. At home, James and Grace watched the coverage unfold. Amara sat between them, her head resting on her mother's shoulder as they read the supportive messages flooding in. "You've started something important," Grace said, squeezing James's hand. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure no one else goes through what we did." James nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "We're not stopping until we see real change." As the city's lights twinkled outside their window, the Archers knew the fight was far from over. But together, they were ready to face whatever came next. Breaking the silence. The aftermath of the Archers' decision to go public rippled far beyond their family. In the days following the media coverage, Corinthian Medical Center became the epicenter of a growing movement. More patients came forward, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment and dismissal at the hands of Dr. Victor Latham. Anonymous nurses and junior doctors began leaking stories of a toxic culture within the hospital, one that protected its star physicians at the expense of patient care. At the Archer penthouse, James's home office was transformed into a command center. Stacks of legal documents, press clippings, and emails covered his desk. His legal team worked tirelessly to compile every piece of evidence against Dr. Latham and Corinthian Medical Center. Grace joined him, organizing outreach efforts and responding to messages from families who had reached out in support. "James, look at this," Grace said one morning, holding up her tablet. "A woman named Clara Johnson just sent an email. She says Dr. Latham dismissed her son's symptoms for months. By the time another doctor caught it, his condition had worsened significantly." James frowned, scanning the email. "It's a pattern. He dismisses patients who don't fit his idea of what a serious case looks like. It's negligence, plain and simple." Grace nodded, her eyes hardening. "We need to include her story in the report. This is bigger than us. If we can push for systemic change, maybe we can make a real difference." At Corinthian Medical Center, the pressure was mounting. Dr. Ellen Moreno, the chief of staff, faced growing scrutiny from the board of directors. The hospital's reputation was on the line, and the board demanded immediate action. In an emergency meeting, Ellen addressed the assembled directors. "We cannot afford to ignore this any longer. Dr. Latham's behavior has been a liability for years, and now it's threatening the integrity of this institution." One of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, leaned forward. "What do you propose, Ellen? Terminating a doctor of his stature will bring its own set of complications. We need a strategy." Ellen's jaw tightened. "I've already initiated an internal review of Dr. Latham's cases. We've identified multiple instances of patient complaints that were improperly handled. I recommend suspending him immediately and issuing a public statement acknowledging our commitment to reform." The room erupted in murmurs. Another board member raised his hand. "What about the lawsuit? If the Archers proceed, we could be looking at significant damages. Can we negotiate a settlement? Ellen's expression darkened. The Archers aren't interested in money. They want accountability and systemic change. If we don't act decisively, we'll lose what little trust the public still has in us. After a tense silence, the board voted to suspend Dr. Latham pending the outcome of the review. It was a small step, but Ellen knew it was far from enough. Meanwhile, Grace and James worked to amplify their message. They partnered with advocacy groups focused on patient rights and medical accountability, lending their platform to others who had experienced similar injustices. Social media became a powerful tool, with the hashtag #PatientsDeserveBetter trending nationwide. One evening, Grace hosted a virtual town hall. Dozens of families joined, sharing their stories in a heartbreaking but empowering session. Clara Johnson was among them, her voice trembling as she recounted her son's ordeal. "I trusted Dr. Latham because he was supposed to be the best," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "But he dismissed us like we didn't matter. My son's health suffered because of his arrogance. I'm here because I don't want anyone else to go through what we did." The Archers listened intently, offering words of support and gratitude. When it was over, Grace turned to James, her eyes glistening. "We're not alone in this. That gives me hope." James nodded, his voice resolute. "We're building something bigger than just holding Latham accountable. This is about changing the culture of medicine." As the weeks passed, the Archers' efforts began to bear fruit. Corinthian Medical Center announced a new task force dedicated to improving patient care and addressing systemic bias. Dr. Latham, still under suspension, faced mounting legal challenges as more families came forward with their stories. But the fight was far from over. James received a call from Monica, his lead attorney, late one evening. "James, I've reviewed the latest reports from Corinthian," Monica said. "Their internal review is uncovering significant issues, but there's pushback from some of the higher-ups. They're worried about losing funding from wealthy donors who supported Latham." James's jaw tightened. "What can we do to keep the pressure on?" "Continue amplifying the stories," Monica replied. "And be prepared to escalate. If the hospital drags its feet, we can involve regulatory agencies and push for external oversight." James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "We're not letting them stall. They owe it to every patient who walked through their doors expecting care and compassion." One morning, as the Archers were preparing for another round of interviews, Grace's phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it to find a message from Dr. Harris, the pediatric specialist who had treated Amara. "I just wanted to let you know that Amara's procedure was a success," Dr. Harris wrote. "She's recovering beautifully, and I'm confident she'll be back to her energetic self soon." Grace smiled, relief washing over her. She showed the message to James, who hugged her tightly. "We're getting through this," he said softly. "One step at a time." Amara, sitting nearby with her favorite stuffed bunny, looked up and smiled. "Does this mean I can play outside again soon?" Grace laughed, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." As they sat together, the weight of their journey felt a little lighter. The Archers knew there were still battles ahead, but their resolve was unshaken. They were not just fighting for justice, they were fighting for a better future for Amara and countless others like her. The tides of accountability. Corinthian Medical Center was no longer the untouchable bastion of elite healthcare it once prided itself on being. The allegations against Dr. Latham had pulled the curtain back on systemic issues long ignored, and the pressure to act decisively intensified daily. Public protests had moved from the sidewalks to the hospital's front doors, where families held signs demanding justice for those harmed by negligence and bias. Inside the hospital's boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The board of directors had convened for an emergency meeting, their expressions ranging from concern to outright panic. Dr. Ellen Moreno stood at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel. "We're out of time," Ellen began, her tone steely. "The Archers campaign has galvanized public opinion against us. The media coverage, the protests, the social media backlash, it's all snowballing. We need to show the public that we're committed to meaningful change." One board member, an elderly man with thinning hair, scowled. "Meaningful change? You're suggesting we throw one of our top doctors under the bus? Latham brings in wealthy clients. If we cut him loose, we risk alienating donors." Ellen's gaze hardened. "And if we don't, we risk the hospital's very existence. The Archers are not just any family. James Archer's influence stretches far beyond this city, and he's made it clear that he's prepared to use every resource at his disposal. This is bigger than one doctor." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Finally, the head of the board, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Cho, spoke up. "We'll issue a public statement announcing Dr. Latham's termination and the launch of an independent review into hospital practices," she said. "Additionally, we'll establish a patient advocacy program to rebuild trust. This is the only way forward." Ellen nodded, relief flickering across her face. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Meanwhile, at the Archer penthouse, James and Grace were working on the next phase of their campaign. Amara was resting upstairs, her recovery progressing steadily. Despite the turmoil, her laughter had returned, a sound that filled the home with a sense of hope. "We've received over 100 emails from families thanking us for speaking out," Grace said, scrolling through her inbox. "Some of these stories. James, they're heartbreaking. This is bigger than Latham. It's about changing the system." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We need to create a platform where these voices can be heard. A place where people can share their experiences and push for change. Something lasting." Grace's eyes lit up. "What about a foundation? We could focus on patient advocacy, medical equity, and accountability." James smiled, nodding. "The Amara Foundation. Named after the bravest little girl I know." 2 days later, the Archers held a press conference to announce the launch of the Amara Foundation. The event was held at a local community center, its modest setting a deliberate choice to emphasize accessibility and inclusivity. Journalists from major outlets packed the room, their cameras trained on James and Grace as they stood behind a podium. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice steady and firm. "When my daughter, Amara, was mistreated by a trusted physician, my family was devastated. But what we've learned since then is that our story is not unique. Across this country, countless families have faced similar injustices, often without the resources to fight back. That ends today." Grace stepped forward, her tone warm but resolute. "The Amara Foundation will serve as a beacon for those who have been silenced. We'll provide resources, legal support, and advocacy for patients who deserve better. And we'll push for reforms that prioritize compassion and equity in healthcare." The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Clara Johnson, who had become a close ally of the Archers. She wiped away tears as she listened, inspired by the couple's determination to create lasting change. Back at Corinthian Medical Center, the fallout from the Archers campaign continued to escalate. Dr. Latham's termination had been announced that morning, accompanied by a formal apology from the hospital. Yet, the damage to his reputation was irreparable. In his upscale home office, Dr. Latham sat alone, staring at the statement on his phone. The words blurred as his anger and humiliation consumed him. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, a man whose credentials shielded him from scrutiny. Now, that illusion had shattered. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His lawyer, a wiry man with sharp features, entered with a grim expression. "Victor, we've got a problem," the lawyer said, placing a folder on the desk. "The state medical board has launched an investigation into your conduct. If they find evidence of malpractice, you could lose your license." Dr. Latham's hands clenched into fists. This is a witch hunt. The Archers are using their wealth to destroy me. The lawyer's gaze was unflinching. They're not the only ones, Victor. More families are coming forward, and the evidence is mounting. You need to prepare for the possibility that this won't end in your favor. Dr. Latham said nothing, his mind racing. For the first time, he realized that his arrogance had brought him to this point, and there was no easy way out. As the days turned into weeks, the Archers' efforts continued to gain momentum. The Amara Foundation's website launched, featuring testimonials from families and resources for navigating the healthcare system. Their story became a catalyst for national conversations about medical accountability, sparking debates in newsrooms and legislative chambers alike. One evening, as the family sat together in their living room, Amara looked up from her sketchbook. "Mommy? Daddy? Are we helping people?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Grace smiled, wrapping an arm around her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. Because of you, a lot of people are getting the help they need. You've made a difference." James leaned forward, his eyes full of pride. "You're our inspiration, Amara. This all started because of you." Amara beamed, her small hands clutching her bunny. For the first time in weeks, her world felt safe and full of promise. As the city lights twinkled outside their window, the Archers knew their journey was far from over. But they also knew they had created something enduring, a legacy of justice, compassion, and hope. A new dawn. The day of Corinthian Medical Center's public reckoning dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Outside the hospital, the crowd of protesters had swelled to its largest yet, a sea of determined faces holding signs that read "Accountability Now" and "Patience Over Profits." News crews lined the perimeter, their cameras capturing every moment as the institution prepared for its most critical press conference in decades. Inside the hospital's main auditorium, Dr. Ellen Moreno stood behind the podium. The once confident chief of staff looked weary but resolute, her eyes scanning the room filled with journalists, staff, and concerned citizens. She adjusted the microphone, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Good morning," she began. "Today, we address not just the actions of one individual, but the systemic failures that allowed those actions to persist unchecked. As Chief of Staff, I take full responsibility for the lapses in oversight and the harm caused to our patients. This ends now." The room was silent except for the rapid clicks of cameras. Ellen took a deep breath before continuing. "Dr. Victor Latham has been terminated from Corinthian Medical Center, and we are fully cooperating with the ongoing investigation by the State Medical Board. Additionally, we are implementing immediate reforms, including mandatory cultural competency training, the creation of a patient advocacy office, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review all patient complaints." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "To the families who suffered, we apologize. To the Archers, whose courage sparked this change, we owe a debt of gratitude. Your voices have been heard, and we are committed to doing better." The applause that followed was muted but sincere, a small step toward healing a deep wound. Watching the live broadcast from their living room, James, Grace, and Amara sat together, their emotions a mix of relief and resolve. Amara's recovery had been steady, her energy and brightness slowly returning. She clutched her stuffed bunny as the family listened to Ellen's words. "Do you think they mean it?" Grace asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. James nodded slowly. "I think they're trying. But meaningful change takes time. We'll keep watching, keep holding them accountable." Amara looked up at her parents, her eyes curious. "Are the other kids going to be okay now?" Grace smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Because of you, Amara, they'll have a better chance. You've made a difference." Over the next months, the Archers poured their energy into the Amara Foundation. What began as a small advocacy initiative quickly grew into a national movement. The foundation's hotline received hundreds of calls weekly, connecting families with legal resources, medical experts, and emotional support. Their online platform became a hub for storytelling, where patients shared their experiences and found solidarity. Clara Johnson, whose story had been one of the first to gain public attention, joined the foundation's advisory board. She brought a fierce determination to the role, advocating for policy changes and speaking at events across the country. "This isn't just about healthcare," Clara said at one such event. "It's about humanity. About treating every person with the dignity they deserve." The Archers' work began to attract the attention of policymakers. Grace and James were invited to testify before a congressional committee on healthcare reform. Standing before a packed chamber, James spoke with the same resolve that had driven him from the start. "No family should have to fight this hard for basic respect and competent care," he said. "We're here not just for our daughter, but for every child, every parent, every person who has been ignored or mistreated. It's time to put patients first." Back at Corinthian Medical Center, the reforms began to take root. The newly established Patient Advocacy Office handled complaints with diligence and transparency. Dr. Ellen Marino's leadership, though tested, earned her respect as she pushed for cultural shifts within the institution. Staff underwent comprehensive training programs, and the hospital's board embraced greater diversity to better reflect the community it served. Dr. Latham, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of his actions. The state medical board found him guilty of gross negligence and unethical conduct, revoking his license. The once revered physician now lived in obscurity, a stark reminder of the cost of arrogance and prejudice. One evening, as the Archers gathered for dinner, Amara presented her parents with a drawing. It depicted their family standing together, surrounded by smiling faces of all colors and ages. Above them, in bold letters, she had written, "We helped." James knelt beside her, his voice full of emotion. "You're right, Princess. We did." Grace kissed the top of Amara's head, her heart swelling with pride. "And we'll keep helping. Together." As they sat down to eat, the city lights glittered outside their window, a reminder of the world they were striving to change. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had also been transformative. The Archers had turned their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that would endure for generations. And in the quiet strength of their unity, they knew, this was only the beginning.